When you really think about it, shouldn't everyone want the Easter story to be true, the resurrection of Jesus to be true? Because if you really think about it, if the Easter story is true, that means that death doesn't have the last word. It means that death is not the end of our story. It would mean that it was really true that God miraculously was born through a virgin and did the miracles he did and taught what he taught and died on the cross and rose from the dead because he has a resurrection purpose for this whole world and for your life that really matters. If it's true, it would mean that you matter, that you're not an accident. This universe isn't an accident. There's a reason it exists, and there's a reason why you exist. When you think about it, shouldn't everyone want the Easter story to be true? But there are good reasons why some don't. And one of the biggest reasons why some don't want the Easter story to be true is because of the bad example set by those who do. Bad example set morally for sure, but also just embarrassing examples. Now, I know for a fact it's all too easy to, at times, set an embarrassing example of something I believe. And we see that true with the executives of Microsoft back in 1995 when they were releasing Windows 95. They were all on stage, and we see how, well, they at least would set an embarrassing example of a good thing. The resolution's not great, but let's take a moment and watch the release announcement in 1995 by the Microsoft execs of Windows 95. That's Bill Gates, the guy who now is giving $2 billion to fund the development of vaccines for the coronavirus. But back in 1995, if you were watching the release of Windows 95, and these are the people who are responsible for it, if you based whether or not you made a decision of whether or not you should go Windows 95 based upon whether or not you were embarrassed by its chief representatives, you might have opted out. But that would have been a big mistake because Windows 95 brought a whole new 32-bit technology to the graphical user interface. You would have missed out on a huge technological advancement. Now, 2,000 years of Christians on the stage of world history have no shortage of embarrassing examples. Embarrassing at best, but some real moral flaws. And even closer to home in our country, in our day and age, we all know there are cringeworthy, goofy, embarrassing examples of Christians, American Christians today, and some with serious moral flaws. But if you base your decision about Jesus on the example of American Christians, whether or not they were embarrassing or even seriously moral mistakes, that could be one of the biggest mistakes you would ever make in your life. Because the Jesus of 2,000 years ago didn't know any American Christians. He didn't know any white people, for that matter, as far as we know. And he never spoke English, never heard English, because English wasn't even a language then. Now, let's be honest. All Christians, all churches are both a mixture of being really helpful at times and being hurtful at times. That's just human nature. That's true of everyone, and that includes Christians. Now, I know here at the Crossing, we've been a church for 20 years, and I know for a fact we have been really helpful to a lot of people. We still are, but I also know stories where, if we're honest, we've been hurtful to some as well. For me, if all I had to go on was the example of Christians, many Christians that are American Christians today, of whether or not I would believe in Jesus, I'll be honest, I probably wouldn't believe in Jesus today, if that's all I had to go on. In fact, I don't believe in the Jesus of many professing Christians. That's not the Jesus I believe in. But not only the problem of the bad example set by Christians that's real, and we have to be honest, it's all around us, but there's also the good example set by those who believe in different religions. See, it's hard to say that Christianity is the only right way just because that's what you're most used to. Any educated person has to question their own faith tradition, and that would be true of Christians as well. And to me, it all comes down to really one thing that I think cuts through it all. Did Jesus really rise from the dead? Because if Jesus really did rise from the dead, it really does cut through all the embarrassing examples, and it really does cut through all these other religions. Because if Jesus really did rise from the dead the third day after being dead, it really would mean that everything Jesus said was true, and the Jesus of the Bible is the one that we should all believe in spite of all the very real bad examples of Christians today, and in spite of all the good examples of people who believe in a different religion. But how can you know? How can we know whether or not Jesus rose from the dead 2,000 years ago? And see, it's historical knowledge is different than scientific knowledge. So how do you know who's right when different people disagree? Some intelligent people disagree. To me, a great example has always been the Apollo astronauts and the mission to the moon. This past summer was the 50-year anniversary of the Apollo 11 landing on the moon. And in fact, this very weekend, right now, is the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 13 journey. Remember, that was the one that had the problem, so they didn't land on the moon. They had to circle the moon, and they barely made it back. But one of the biggest technological advances that allowed us to send men to the moon was the Saturn V rocket. It was a huge invention, and this is Wernher von Braun, who was the chief figure in the American rocket endeavors. He's the one that was behind the development of the Saturn V rocket. It was this huge, heavy rocket that was able to propel all this machinery to the moon and back. And it's still, even now, the most powerful rocket ever made. Now, one little tidbit is the problem is that Wernher von Braun, back in his 20s and 30s, was a Nazi developing the rocket program for Nazi Germany. Now, he was captured by the Americans. He, in all disclosure, wanted to be captured by the Americans, and he eventually became the head of our own rocket program. There's another good example of a bad example doing a good thing. But the Saturn V rocket was the force behind Apollo 8's mission to the moon in 1968 and all the Apollo missions through 1972. In spite of everyone back then watching these rockets take off the 8 times they did, if you include Apollo 8, the impressive takeoff and all this impressive journey and the TV footage of orbiting the moon, the TV footage of landing on the moon, the TV footage of walking on the moon, in spite of the high-resolution color photos that they brought back, in spite of the moon rocks that they brought back, for the past 40 years and maybe more, there have been serious, intelligent skeptics who say the whole thing was a hoax of propaganda. In fact, if you even look online now, you'll see intelligent, skeptical people putting forth arguments of why they think the whole thing was a hoax. In fact, even this morning I looked online at a survey, and as many as 20% of Americans today believe the arguments, because these are intelligent people making the arguments. They're articulate. They're reasoned arguments. 20% of Americans today believe we never went to the moon. The whole thing was a hoax. 25% of Britons believe that. But to me, yes, the TV footage, I suppose, could be faked. I suppose there are ways to make high-resolution color photos doctored up and faked. I suppose there's ways to find some rock, some obscure place on the earth or some meteor and say, look, this is a moon rock. Isn't that great? I suppose it's possible to blast off a Saturn V rocket into space and have them orbit for a week and then come back down and say, we all went to the moon. Isn't that great? But to me, again, historical knowledge is different than scientific knowledge. How do we know we actually went to the moon? To me, it all comes down to the credibility of the 24 Apollo astronauts who say that they did journey to the moon and the 12 Apollo astronauts who say that they did walk on the moon. In fact, in this weekend's Wall Street Journal, there's another account from Jim Lovell, who was the commander of Apollo 13, and he also was on the Apollo 8 trip around the moon, telling his story. But I've seen documentaries, I've read documents. There are some incredible documentaries where these astronauts, even in their older age, are interviewed, and you can watch on their faces, they're talking from memory. They're rather emotionally involved in their memory. They're passionate about this. And in all these years of talking about their memories and talking about nobody has recanted. Nobody has said this was a hoax after all these years. They still talk about it passionately as the most important event that ever occurred in their life. Now here's the question, are they telling the truth or are they lying? That's what it all comes down to me. In spite of intelligent people making reasoned arguments of why they're skeptical, why they think the whole thing was a hoax, in spite of 20% people that are probably rather intelligent that believe the whole thing was a hoax, I do believe the astronauts landed on the moon 50 years ago because I believe the eyewitnesses that said they did it. I think their story is credible when I hear what they have to say and how they say it. Now here's the question that we're asking today on Easter. Did Jesus really rise from the dead? And I know some very intelligent people who make very good, reasonable arguments of why they think the whole thing was a hoax, why they think Christianity was the biggest hoax ever put upon the world. These are intelligent people, I think, making reasoned arguments. But to me, it all comes down to whether or not you believe the documents that we have today that were written by the eyewitnesses, how they lived their lives, how they were passionate when they told their account of Jesus' resurrection, how they lived some 30, some even 60 years after the resurrection that they claimed they were witnesses of, and none of them recanted their story. Almost all the documents that comprise what we call the New Testament are documents of these eyewitnesses to Jesus' resurrection. Take the documents by the Apostle Peter, for example. In all that he writes about the resurrection, he says this in 2 Peter 1:16. He says, "We did not follow cleverly devised myths when we made known to you the power of the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty." Now, the same Peter who wrote this document that we have in what we call the New Testament, he talks about being an eyewitness of Jesus' life and death and resurrection. That same Peter, 30 years later, in about 62 AD, was crucified upside down because he wouldn't stop being an eyewitness of Jesus' resurrection. Or take the Apostle John, another witness of Jesus' resurrection. The Apostle John writes this in 1 John. He says, "That which we have heard, that which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked at and our hands have touched, this we proclaim. We proclaim to you what we have seen and heard." Now, this same John was very, very young when he was a disciple of Jesus. He ended up living another 60-something years until like 90 AD, according to history. This same John wouldn't stop proclaiming what he had seen and what he had heard and what he had touched when he touched Jesus' resurrected body, his nail scars in his hands. So much so that he was boiled in oil and his eyes were plucked out and he was imprisoned on an island at the end of his life. Peter, who went before, was crucified upside down because he wouldn't stop proclaiming, wouldn't stop being an eyewitness. And then there's the Apostle Paul. Now here's something really interesting. There's no skeptic, there's no non-Christian that I know of at any accredited university that's a biblical scholar or any kind of an ancient historical scholar of the ancient Near East that would deny that the Apostle Paul wrote the letter we have in the New Testament called 1 Corinthians. It's one of those 4 core letters that nobody, even the most skeptical, deny that the Apostle Paul wrote. Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, and Galatians. Nobody denies he wrote those. And in the document we call 1 Corinthians, nobody denies, they all agree that it was probably written around 51, 52 AD, so about 20 years after the events of Jesus' death and resurrection. That's not a long enough time for some big Christ myth to take place. The same time distance between Paul writing 1 Corinthians and the events of Jesus' death and resurrection is about the same time distance between now and the events of 9/11. We still have people now, witnesses of what they experienced at 9/11, and it's not like we think that's so far away that anything they're saying has to be myth by now. We think that their memory can still be real in 20 years. And the Apostle Paul writes in this document what is the main message of the early Christians. In chapter 15, verse 1, he says, "Now, brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of the gospel." This is the main message. The good news is what that means. "The gospel I preached to you." So even though he writes this now in about 51, 52 AD, the time when he was preaching to them was about 48 AD, and so he's referring back even to 4 years before. And here's what he remembers saying to them, and he's saying it again, that Christ died for our sins, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day. Let's go to the next slide. And that he appeared to Cephas. That's just another name for the Apostle Peter. Jesus changed his name to Peter, but many of them still called him Cephas. I think I'd rather be called Peter. And then to the 12, after that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time. It's hard for 500 people at the same time to have some common illusion. Most of whom are still living. You can talk to them now, Paul says. Then he appeared to James. That's the half-brother of Jesus. They had the same mother. James was a skeptic of Jesus, we read in the Gospels. During Jesus' life, something major happened that changed his life, and he became one of the authors of the New Testament book of James. Well, obviously what changed his life was that he saw his brother risen from the dead. Then all the apostles he appeared to, and last of all, Paul says, he appeared to me also. Now, history tells us that this apostle Paul who wrote this was executed by the Roman emperor because he wouldn't stop proclaiming what he had told them and what he was telling them in this letter. He wouldn't stop proclaiming his witness to the resurrected Jesus. In fact, every one of the people Paul names in what we just read here, they all died. They all were executed because they wouldn't stop proclaiming their witness of the resurrected Jesus. They wouldn't stop, and so they paid the price of their lives because they wouldn't stop, and they had no reason, nothing to gain by lying. They had everything to lose, including their lives. Still, there will always be reasonable arguments by intelligent people that are never going to be convinced by the evidence. Never. But that's not what we're trying to talk about today. What we're talking today about is, what do you think? Have you ever read the eyewitness accounts in what we call the New Testament? In the Gospel of Matthew or Mark or Luke or John, or even like what Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians and other places? What do you think? Because see, here's the deal. If these witnesses are telling the truth and not lying, if they died for the truth and rather for something that they knew was a lie, if these witnesses who had nothing to gain by lying, everything to lose by telling the truth, if they're telling the truth, then that means that you're reading the New Testament accounts of Jesus's, when you read Jesus's miraculous birth, when you read of Jesus's teachings, when you read of Jesus's miracles, when you read of Jesus's death on the cross, when you read of Jesus's resurrection from the dead by these eyewitnesses, you're not just reading a story once upon a time. You're reading something that really happened in real time in front of real people who became real witnesses. But here's the thing I want you to get. When you read that story, what you're really reading is the story that your life is in. This is a story your life is in, and the story that you see your life in, the story that you see yourself in, determines the kind of role you want your life to play. You ever thought about your life that way? That your life is a role that you're playing in a story? That's what would be true if Easter is true. Because if it's true, that means that death will not have the last word in your life, in spite of the fears and the uncertainties we're all going through now in this time of virus. Death will not be the end of the story for you. And because if it's true, everything Jesus taught, everything happened with Jesus' miracles and Jesus' teaching and the virgin birth of God becoming human in the person of Jesus and dying on the cross and rising from the dead, all of it confirms, all of it means that God has a resurrection purpose for your life. And that your life really matters in this story. And that you're not an accident. God wanted you to live in his universe, and he has a resurrection story for you. Now, what do you think? Will you let the bad examples of those who believe these things keep you away from the real Jesus? The very last words that Jesus speaks in the Gospel of Matthew, he says that he is the ruler over heaven and earth. And he says to his followers, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. The risen Jesus says he's the Lord of heaven and earth. He's the ruler of heaven and earth. And somehow we instinctively know our own moral failures. And there's something inside of us that wants to hide from the Lord of heaven and earth because we know we have sin. We know we've disobeyed. We know we still disobey. We know we still have moral failure. And there's something about us that doesn't want us to come before him, but to try to hide. But Jesus says, come to me, all who are weary and heavily burdened, and I'll give you rest. Jesus says, don't try to hide from me with your sin. Come to me. It's because of your sin that I came. I came to die on the cross for your sin. I came to rise from the dead to give you a resurrection one day, to get rid of your sin so you can have a new body without sin on a restored earth without evil. That's why I came. Don't run from me because of your sin. Come to me. Come to me. Because I'm the only one you can trust. You can't even trust yourself with your life. But you can trust me. I'm the Lord of heaven and earth, and I came for you. So come to me, and I will give you new life. Happy Easter.
As we end our time together.